This is the Mid-America PTTC podcast, where we believe prevention is better together, and together we are stronger. I'm your host, Steve Miller. This is episode 61, and in today's podcast, I have the pleasure of speaking with Chris Davis. He is the Vice President of Prevention and Youth Support at Community Partnership of the Ozarks in Springfield, Missouri. Chris began his career as a counselor, but 23 years ago started his journey into substance use and violence prevention. Mr. Davis and his team provide services across a multi-county region of southwest Missouri, and in some regards, he is an unofficial historian of prevention across his state and is affectionately known as Mr. Logic Model due to his interest in perfecting the model and his passion for teaching that skill. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. Well, welcome to our podcast, Chris Davis. Glad you're here.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here.
Well, I already let the cat out of the bag. You started out as a counselor, but you found your way into this profession. Can you tell us a little bit about your path into prevention?
Sure. I did start as a counselor, master's and specialist, and my focus initially was on working with the family members of persons going through substance use disorder treatment, a lot of the kids especially. I worked in Kansas in the foster care system as a family therapist for a while. And then I moved over to Springfield, where I live now. My best friend from high school lived here, and a small counseling organization. It was a 90-day treatment, in-person treatment center, private agency. Had an opening for a clinical director, so I applied and got it, and was able to move in with my best friend and live that life. Little did I know that the counseling agency, shortly after I was hired, they switched ownership, and the new owner, unbeknownst to those of us working there, started embezzling from the company. And I showed up to work on a Monday morning, and his office had been cleared out. And there was that. So me and one of the other counselors actually stayed on for about two or three more weeks to help transition persons into other treatment facilities. And then I was here in Springfield saying, okay, I need to get a job. So I looked in the newspaper, and there was an advertisement from Community Partnership of the Ozarks for substance abuse prevention specialist. And I'm thinking, well, I know substance abuse. We would now call it substance misuse, but that was the terminology back then. So I came in and interviewed for a prevention specialist position. It was a long interview, about a 2-hour interview, because the interview team just wasn't sure that a counselor could do prevention. And somebody took a chance on me. So I started as a prevention specialist here at CPO just over 23 years ago, and kind of moved my way up. The director of a program left within about 9 months and asked if I would be interested in being the coordinator of that program. And here I am 23 years later.
So I have this question each time we have the podcast, and it's always interesting to me. It's almost without fail, most people, not all, but most people say they kind of just fell into it by accident or by surprise, or they didn't really know what they were getting into. But you've kind of illustrated that. But why did you decide to stay in prevention? What was it that lit your fire?
Looking back at some of the things I did in my previous career prior to this, I realized I was doing prevention, but it just wasn't called prevention. We didn't have organized prevention work back then, but the things I did, it was prevention focused. And I loved counseling. I was able to have an impact on individuals at a time, or maybe small groups at a time. What I found in this side of things, on the prevention side, is I could have an impact on an entire community, working collaboratively with them. And that filled my bucket just in a different way, and much more than the other side of things did for me. So,
well, one of the things that I know about you is, in addition to being known as the Mr. Logic Model, just because you're so passionate about helping people to understand the significance or the importance of the logic model.
Yes,
but I also know that you really are a firm believer that we shouldn't be taking our eyes off the ball when it comes to underage drinking prevention. And so for our audience, I kind of wondered if you might illustrate a little bit about why underage drinking. Why is that the place that we really should start?
You're right. And underage drinking doesn't get the publicity that other drugs get right now. Alcohol is not the only substance misuse issue that needs to be addressed, frankly. We have an opioid epidemic in our country. Meth use continues to be a significant issue in many communities. Risk and consequences related to marijuana use, it's increasing, continues to devastate lives in this country. All of those issues are important and need to be addressed in communities that they're impacting. With that said, the facts support that the prevention of underage drinking should be a primary priority in the community, along with underage tobacco use. Now, the facts may differ from our opinions and our feelings about underage drinking, especially in relation to other substance misuse issues, but facts are facts. We can choose to ignore or minimize the facts because we have different priorities or different agendas, but that still doesn't change the facts. So let me just share a few of the facts here in Missouri, and a lot of this will transpose across the country as well. Alcohol kills more teens than all other drugs combined. That's a fact. In Missouri, the age of first use of alcohol from our 2022 Missouri Student Survey, in Missouri, it's a little over age 13. Here in Greene County, where I'm at, it's about 12 and a half, a little over 12 and a half years old. That's sixth grade. The average age of use of a substance is sixth grade. When I worked in treatment, and I did a lot of the psychosocial assessments of persons coming into an inpatient treatment facility, 100% of the persons who identified with meth as their primary substance of misuse, 100%. You look at their history of substance use, age 10, 11, 12, alcohol, tobacco. No one had I ever worked with started using their first substance as methamphetamine. So yes, all of those other issues that we just talked about, those are a problem and those should be addressed. But at some point going upstream to figure out what is it that gets somebody on that path, and alcohol is always a part of that. So that's critical. Also here in Missouri, for those 6th through 12th grade students that the Missouri Student Survey is given to, youth who drink alcohol in the past 30 days versus those who don't drink alcohol, they're much more likely to misuse other substances. 10 times more likely to use prescription drugs not prescribed to them by a doctor. Over 8 times more likely to use marijuana, 4 times more likely to use heroin, almost 6 times more likely to use meth versus those who don't use alcohol. And youth here who drink alcohol 5.5 times more likely to attempt suicide compared to youth who don't drink alcohol. So yeah, underage drinking, it's a big deal. It's a core component for a lot of other significant challenges later in life. Youth who drink alcohol before age 15, 4-5 times more likely to develop a substance use disorder versus those who wait until they're 21. Because the brain is still developing. And if you introduce substances like alcohol and others, it can rewire things much quicker. If I was an adult waiting until I was at least 21 and didn't have something like family history, which might make things happen a little more quickly, if I drank enough alcohol to develop an alcohol use disorder, they say it would take somewhere between 5 and 15 years, where it could take a young person 6 months or less to develop alcohol use disorder.
Now, why is that? I mean, is there information out there that suggests that there's a reason why that quicker addiction to alcohol?
NIDA has so much information on this, but really that with the brain, that organ developing, it's still growing, it's still developing. And when substances like alcohol are introduced and used, it just kind of rewires those brain pathways in a different way than if they're already established when we're in our mid-20s. It's much harder to rewire something when it's fully developed versus at a younger age. That's why, frankly, kids like my grandson's under 5. And if we were to start to teach him 5 or 6 other languages, he'd pick them up without any problem. I don't know if I would ever be able to learn another language, but it's because their brain is so malleable and able to adapt and adjust in a positive way, but also in negative ways when you're talking about substance misuse.
Well, those that follow the podcast regularly, and if you haven't been, you can go back and listen to the podcast before this one. And we spoke with Dr. Carolyn DuPont, and her father lead an initiative at the national level called One Choice. And her research would illustrate similar to what you're discussing. The longer you can put off the exposure to the first drink, the better chances you have for cognitive development across the lifespan. And so I find that to be very powerful, but yet I think that message somehow or another gets lost in our communities these days. And do you think that's because we have such a national eye on the epidemics that are happening, like opioid overdose and so forth?
I'd say yes, in part, but even prior to that, it's been a challenge to elevate youth alcohol use or underage drinking or alcohol use, misuse in general, to a high priority level in communities. It's a regulated substance, right? So it's legal for persons over 21 to use. There is so much promotion of alcohol in the media, commercials, you name it. It's part of that of our culture. And I mean, gosh, you watch the Super Bowl, and what are the ads that people gravitate towards? It's those that involve alcohol businesses. So it's become such part of our culture. And the reality is, not everybody who drinks as a young person develops a substance use disorder, thankfully. I think, and this data may be a little outdated because I can't remember when it was done, but I think what I recall was that I believe about 16% there's a 16% chance that a young person who's drinking alcohol will eventually develop an alcohol use disorder, or maybe it's 9%, somewhere between 9 and 16. So we as adults, we think back to when we were teens, and many of us who might have engaged in underage drinking did not develop and did not have significant consequences from use. So if we can't directly relate, then we think that's not a big deal because it's not going to hurt anybody else. So we kind of ignore what the risks are. It's like, it's just one bullet in the gun instead of, and there's 10 chambers. So there's only a 1 in 10 chance of me actually having a tragedy if I pull the trigger. Nobody would do that, but we're doing that with alcohol. We're putting our youth at risk by being complacent, by not having those honest discussions and sharing those clear no use messages, and helping the youth develop resistance skills and resiliency skills so that they are equipped to not engage in underage drinking when the time will and does come before them.
It's certainly obvious that there are challenges in getting the message across about delaying the use of alcohol, choosing not to engage. But across your career span, you've been keeping an eye on it, making that a priority. So can you talk a little bit about some of maybe the successes that you've had with some underage drinking prevention?
Sure. And as you mentioned early on, we here in a community partnership, we cover 21 counties here in Southwest and South Central Missouri. Greene County is the county that Springfield is in, and Springfield is the third largest community here in Missouri. So I'll share a little bit about some things happening that we've done here in the Springfield area. And then many people will be familiar with Branson, Missouri. Branson is in Taney County, which is, about 30, 45 miles or so south of Springfield. So I'll share some things that happened down in the Branson area over the last decade and a half as well. So kind of start with here in Springfield. Back in 1998, the Underage Drinking Task Force was formed. And the county prosecutor was actually one of the key initiators of that task force. And part of the reason was looking back at the data. underage drinking in Greene County, past 30-day use in Greene County back in 97, which is the earliest survey data I found, showed that 53% of the 10th graders in Greene County were drinking alcohol. 53% were currently drinking alcohol. So Community Partnership and the Underage Drinking Task Force kind of got started, and it had a broad-based community engagement. We had a lot of the community stakeholders involved. The Underage Drinking Task Force was actually used as a model for a lot of other coalitions being developed across the region and probably across the state. And one is a coalition that started in Branson. And here in Springfield, the Underage Drinking Task Force initiated alcohol compliance checks for the first time. I remember when it was actually the sheriff's department was willing to do some educational things. So it wasn't even enforced compliance checks at the time. They were going out with youth just to educate retailers, and they saw such a need that they started implementing, and then Springfield Police Department started implementing alcohol compliance checks. And over the years, thousands and thousands and thousands of compliance checks have occurred here. Back when they started, we have a number of colleges here in the Springfield area, Missouri State University being one, and this was known as a college drinking town. I mean, it was one of the reasons why a lot of college students would come here because of alcohol. So over the last 20 years, that's changed, and the community norms related to alcohol use has changed a lot. There's still a lot of room to grow, but it's no longer seen as the party town USA for college students like it was before the Underage Drinking Task Force. So back in 2008, I actually was watching one of the local TV news stations, Evening News, and there was a story that the Branson mayor was speaking about. And in Branson, they had established this. They had just created this, the Branson Landing, which was an outdoor kind of a mall area, big deal down in Branson then. And this was late 2007, and one of the kiosks there in Branson got an alcohol license, and people would be going to that kiosk, get alcohol, and then they were walking through the stores with alcohol. And that was not the intent for Branson issuing that license. So the mayor said, this is a family-friendly community. This wasn't what we expected, and we need to do some things to make sure that that things like this don't occur in the future. So I saw that article. I gave Mayor Presley a call and said, hey, I'm with Community Partnership. We're the Prevention Resource Center that covers this area. And let me tell you a little bit about us and the prevention support and resources we have. So I shared with her some things. At that time, the national town hall meetings where SAMHSA had the underage drinking town hall meetings happening, I think every other year. And there was an opportunity for, I think it was, at the time, they were offering stipends of a couple $100 maybe to host a town hall meeting in your community. So I said, hey, how about us setting up a town hall meeting there in Branson and getting a panel of some of your key leaders to talk about this? And she loved it. And so we had a town hall meeting there in Branson. She was on the panel, got the chief of police, the county prosecutor, someone from a treatment facility, just talking about underage drinking and its impact on the community. And from that town hall meeting, 2 months later, it was called the Branson Underage Drinking Prevention Coalition was formed. And within 7 months, they had established one of the most robust alcohol-focused ordinances I've ever seen in my life. It was an incredible ordinance, and it was because the mayor and the chief of police were the co-chairs of that coalition, and the chief of police at the time said, "You're looking at our calls for service, 90% are related to alcohol use by youth. So we've got to do something about this." They had community meetings. Alcohol retailers showed up, and they're like, "This, we're worried we're going to lose business. We're worried we're going to be put out of business." Instead of being the adversaries, they said, "You be part of the solution." So they joined the coalition, and it's about a 40-plus page ordinance. But some of the key components, Branson is obviously known as a big tourist community. They actually, I think at the time, and it still may be true, had more theater seats than Broadway in Broadway district in New York City, in the Branson area. So they had 7 times the alcohol outlet density than the average for Missouri. Branson's population at the time was about 10,000 people. And they had over 100 alcohol licensees. So one thing that they incorporated into their ordinance was mandatory approved alcohol retailer training, responsible beverage service training, et cetera. And it could be in-house, but the city staff had to approve. City licensing had to approve their ordinance or their training. And I think in that first year, I went down and we facilitated responsible beverage service trainings. Probably over 1,000 employees went through it. Anybody who worked for the business had to go through an approved training within 60 days of employment, and then every 2 years thereafter. And we still, to this day, every 2 months, are down in Branson providing that free training to those retailers. They also, I thought it was very novel. They established where at midnight, anybody under 21 that was in a facility that had alcohol had to leave the facility unless they were there with their parent or legal guardian. Now, again, thinking about that being a community where there's a lot of tourists, they saw, their data showed that between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. is when a lot of underage youth alcohol-related significant consequences were occurring. A lot of interpersonal violence, a lot of alcohol-related traffic issues, et cetera. So they put that ordinance in place, and I love it because you think about if a club or something like that all lets out at the same time, there's predators that are watching those young-looking persons who may be intoxicated, and they know that they're more vulnerable to being attacked or being coerced in some way. So by making sure that young people left at midnight instead of 1, well, if this old guy is following out some young people, it's much more obvious that that something might be up. So to me, as far as sexual assault prevention, things like that, I love that they incorporated that because, and I've never heard of anything like that in an ordinance. But again, Branson was very creative on how do we reduce not just the prevalence of underage drinking, but any of the related consequences that may go along with that. So one of the things that they applied, and in the first year, they were a semifinalist in CADCA's Got Outcomes Award. And I talked to the person at CADCA that kind of reviewed a lot of that, and they said, we encourage them to apply again next year. We can't award the award in the first year of existence because the world would come unglued. so we need a little bit more longevity. So they applied the next year and got it in their second year. That's an award that's given out to, for that category, one coalition across the country, and they got it in their second year of existence. So, and all of this to say, yeah, that's great that they're doing all these things, but what's the data show? Is it working? Here in Greene County, the Missouri Student Survey is on the Department of Mental Health website. So, and it goes back as far as 2006 on a data querying site. So I looked at Greene County, and past 30-day use of alcohol in 2006 for Greene County, 24.21% of the 6th through 12th graders reported drinking alcohol. Right before the pandemic in 2020, it was 9.05%. That was taken right at the beginning, like January, February, March is when the survey's done. So you would think pandemic is going to from 2020 to 2022, boy, we're going to see a lot of negative consequences. In 2022, the Greene County is down to 7.7%. So yeah, major life disruptions related to the pandemic, but a consistent pattern of underage drinking prevention continued from 24% down to 7.7% now. Branson, very similar outcomes. In 2006, 20.63% of those youth were drinking. And in 2022, that's down to 8.5%. And I calculated kind of Branson, very rough estimate of population back in 2006 to now. And that's about 1,800 fewer kids drinking in Taney County than there were before the coalition started. So.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about also, and you may not have that data handy, but you talked about them instituting like the compliance checks. And I wondered if there was any benchmarks, like when they started that, was the failure rate, I guess it would be, versus where they might be today.
Yeah, I have great. Yeah, in Branson, the very first alcohol compliance checks occurred in 2008, and the pass rate was 22%. So 4 out of 5 times they sold alcohol to minors. With that mandated alcohol training and other things that occur, and they did compliance checks at least quarterly in Branson. And when they did checks of the 114 retailers, the smallest amount of checks that occurred during one of those quarterly operations that I ever saw was about 75, but as high as 114. So every business knew that it's very likely at least quarterly that somebody was going to do a check. And that was just the Branson police. They didn't count the sheriff's office or highway patrol or alcohol and tobacco control or anybody else who can do compliance checks. With that, with the broad community education that was going on and building the coalition and providing healthy alternative activities to youth and all those things, we started seeing the alcohol compliance checks going up. I think the latest I saw, some things during pandemic kind of got paused because of redirection of resources, which was understandable. But in 2020, I think the compliance check pass rate was up to about 94% there in Branson, and had been pretty consistent in that middle to upper 90s from 22%, and you saw steadily increasing. So it directly conversely correlated to it. When that was going up, you saw a decrease in the use amongst the youth. Again, you increase the risk of the consequences. In some ways, that's beneficial. There's fewer retailers providing. That's one avenue where the youth aren't able to get to alcohol, and that's shown to decrease use. So.
Well, it's interesting to see that just in those two community illustrations, what's significant about it is the community supported it, both there where you're at in Springfield and then also down in Branson, that it wasn't just, not that the coalition doesn't play a role in that because those are community members, but they had broad community support for it. And obviously it sounds like community understood the need or the significance of underage drinking or the impact that it would have.
Yeah, and it took a while. Again, it's a topic that, again, as a parent, many parents are like, well, what's the big deal? I drank when I was a kid. And they helped, not in a accusatory way anyway, but just to educate the community on what the facts are versus the myths. The facts are that parents who allow underage drinking in their home, those youth are more likely to misuse alcohol outside of the home than the myth of, well, they're drinking under supervision and I take the keys and everything's safe. And they're more likely to drink outside of that. And what's the big deal? 21. Look, European countries don't have these problems and they have younger drinking ages. Again, the facts show the exact opposite of that. Those countries that have lower drinking ages than the United States, the youth are drinking more to get drunk. They don't have as many car crashes because they don't have as many cars. That makes sense. But a lot of the other negative consequences go up where alcohol is being used by youth. Facts are facts, whether we want to accept it or not.
Well, I appreciate you sharing those two success stories because I'm a firm believer myself that we need to start with the basics when it comes to underage drinking, tobacco use. the things that are readily available are more socially acceptable, and we need to make sure that we have perspective on that when we're doing the prevention work. So before we wrap this up, I'm always interested in, do you have that one little nugget, or is there something maybe that we didn't get to cover, but something that, if you had one thing that you needed to say to the audience, what comes to mind?
Underage drinking, it is a problem of great concern. However, underage drinking is not just a youth problem. It's not just an alcohol retailer problem or a parent problem or a school problem or a law enforcement problem or the problem of a specific political party or ideology. No one person, no group, no matter how awesome the group is, can have a significant impact on this problem on their own. They can have spikes on things, but long-term positive impact on the problem of underage drinking, this is a community problem. And it needs to have the entire community supportive of and involved in helping prevent it. So there's a place at that prevention table for everyone who wants to be part of the solution and not the problem.
A good nugget to part on.
Thanks.
Glad that you were able to join us today, Chris. I hope that you'll come back sometime if we find an opening for you to talk more about the prevention work that you're doing there in Southwest Missouri.
Be glad to help any way I can, Steve.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you for listening to the Mid-America PTTC podcast. To learn more about any upcoming trainings, visit pttcnetwork.org and look under your PTTC for the Mid-America link. Remember, prevention is better together, and together we are stronger.